It had been 2 years since I married Alexis. Recently, though, something had changed. I began to notice a faint, lingering scent on him. A sweet, refreshing fragrance that clearly wasn't his usual cologne. My instincts kicked in, and I decided to confront him one evening when he returned home late again, the faint floral scent still clinging to his clothes. "Busy day?" I asked, glancing up from my laptop as he walked into the room. Alexis looked at me with an unreadable expression, then nodded. "Yeah, had to meet with some clients," he replied, his voice unusually detached. He started to reach for me, as if to embrace me, but then seemed to hesitate, pulling back slightly before sitting down across from me on the sofa. I paused, feeling the sudden distance between us. There was a time when Alexis would sit beside me, sharing the little stresses of his day. Now, it seemed his phone was a better companion than I was. As the days passed, that subtle change in Alexis's behavior became impossible to ignore. Not only did he carry that unfamiliar scent, but his demeanor had shifted entirely. He was no longer the affectionate, gentle man who needed my presence after a long day. Instead, he seemed distant, his attention drifting away even when he was physically beside me. One evening after finishing my work, I closed my laptop, unable to ignore the tension any longer. I glanced toward him, engrossed in his phone on the sofa. "Want to join me for a shower?" I asked, hoping to break the ice and bring back some warmth between us. Alexis looked up, visibly startled, then quickly shook his head. "No, you go ahead. I'll just wait here," he answered, his voice sounding almost mechanical. There was a brief flicker of something, maybe discomfort, as he turned his face away, a faint blush rising on his cheeks. With a sigh, I headed to the bathroom, feeling a pang of disappointment. I had reached out, yet he'd pulled back. As I stood under the warm stream of water, I couldn't shake the feeling that something vital was slipping away from us. For the past 2 years, our marriage had been stable, maybe even too stable considering we had married for convenience, not love. But Alexis had always been a dependable partner, one who shared his heartaches and insecurities with me. Now it was like he'd put up an invisible wall, leaving me alone on the other side. When I stepped out of the bathroom, I noticed him still on the sofa, his face lit up by the screen of his phone. I felt an unsettling pang in my chest as I watched him type, his expression softening in a way I hadn't seen in a long time. I hesitated, then asked, "Are you texting someone?" He looked up, seemingly caught off guard, and gave a slight nod. "Just a friend," he replied casually, though his tone sounded distant. Unable to push the feeling aside, I decided to call my best friend Sophia, the only person who understood me enough to hear my doubts without judgment. "Sophia, something's wrong. Alexis seems different," I began, hoping she'd offer some comfort. "Then maybe you need a break too," she replied, her voice laced with a mischievous undertone. "Go out, have some fun. Remember, this was always a practical arrangement, wasn't it?" Her words hung in the air, a reminder of the boundaries we'd both set at the beginning. But I couldn't help wondering if, somewhere along the way, I'd let my heart cross those lines. After my conversation with Sophia, I couldn't shake the restlessness that had settled in. That night, as I lay beside Alexis, the silence between us felt heavier than ever. I could feel him shifting beside me, the faint scent of berry perfume still lingering on him. For a brief moment, he reached over and tucked the blanket around me. A gentle gesture that used to feel like home, but now seemed like an act from a stranger. "Are you awake?" he whispered, almost as if testing the space between us. "Yes," I replied, my voice barely audible in the darkness. He hesitated, and for a split second I thought he would say something, maybe explain the distance, maybe ease the doubts I'd been burying. But then he rolled over, turning his back to me, leaving the question unasked. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rhythm of his breathing as he drifted into sleep. Memories of his soft smiles and the warmth in his eyes when we first married began to play in my mind, haunting me. I knew this wasn't supposed to be a love story. We had both agreed on that. But somewhere along the line I had let my guard down, let him in, and maybe, just maybe, I had allowed myself to care. In that moment I made up my mind. I couldn't keep pretending everything was normal. Tomorrow I would confront him directly, even if it meant risking the delicate balance we'd managed to maintain for so long. The next morning, as the sun cast soft rays across our quiet home, I resolved to confront Alexis. I found him in the kitchen, sipping coffee, his gaze distant as he stared out the window. The familiar yet unsettling scent of that berry perfume still clung to him, subtle but unmistakable. I took a deep breath, my heart pounding as I approached. "Alexis," I began, my voice steady but strained. "We need to talk." He turned to face me, a flicker of surprise in his eyes, then nodded, gesturing to the dining table. We sat across from each other, the air heavy with the weight of unspoken words. "Who is she?" I asked bluntly, no longer willing to dance around the truth. He blinked, his eyes widening as he seemed to process my question. For a moment silence hung between us, fragile and tense. Then he sighed and rubbed his forehead, as if gathering his thoughts. "It's not what you think," he began, his voice quiet, almost defeated. "There's no one else, at least not in the way you're imagining." "Then why the distance, the late nights, the perfume?" I pressed, my frustration spilling over. "We were supposed to be in this together, Alexis. But lately I feel like I don't even know you." He lowered his gaze, his fingers fidgeting with the edge of his coffee cup. "There are things I haven't told you, things from my past," he admitted softly. I thought I could keep it separate from us, that I could handle it on my own." I clenched my fists, my mind racing with possibilities. "And what does that have to do with our marriage?" He looked up, his gaze meeting mine, vulnerability flickering in his eyes. "Because I didn't want to complicate things between us. But lately I've realized that maybe I don't know how to keep you out of it anymore." A knot formed in my throat as his words sank in. This wasn't about another woman. It was about secrets, about trust, about the silent walls we'd both built to keep each other at arm's length. I wanted to be angry, to demand answers, but the hurt in his eyes softened my resolve. "Alexis," I said quietly, "if we're going to make this work, you need to let me in. No more walls, no more secrets." He nodded, his expression solemn as he reached for my hand. "I'll try," he whispered. And in that moment, I saw the flicker of the man I had once believed I could trust. Days passed after that conversation, and though Alexis promised to open up, the tension still lingered between us. He'd become quieter, introspective, as if waging a silent battle within himself. I could feel the effort he was making, but something still held him back. A hesitation that felt deeply rooted. One evening, he came home earlier than usual, carrying a faint trace of that same berry perfume. My heart sank, but I reminded myself of our conversation, of the promise he made to let me in. As he stepped into the living room, he looked at me, the weight of words unsaid hanging in his gaze. "There's something I want to tell you," he said, his voice low, almost shaky. I nodded, gesturing for him to sit next to me on the sofa. "I'm listening," I replied, my heart pounding as I braced myself for whatever he was about to reveal. He took a deep breath, his fingers anxiously tracing the edge of the coffee table. "Before I met you, there was someone else," he began, his eyes distant, as if reliving a memory he'd buried long ago. "We were young and I thought she was the one. But things fell apart and I never quite understood why." He paused, struggling to find the right words. "I thought I'd moved on, that I'd put it all behind me. But when I saw her again recently, it stirred up things I thought I'd forgotten." My chest tightened. "Is that why you've been so distant? Why you've kept secrets from me?" He nodded, guilt flashing in his eyes. "I didn't want you to think I was still holding on to something. To someone who isn't part of my life anymore. But when I saw her, I realized that maybe I never fully let go." A sharp ache settled in my chest as his words sank in. It wasn't betrayal, but it was a wound all the same. A reminder that in this practical marriage, feelings could still hurt, that expectations, even unspoken, could still be shattered. "Alexis," I whispered, forcing myself to stay calm, "do you still have feelings for her?" He hesitated, looking down, and I felt the air grow heavy with uncertainty. "I don't know," he admitted. "I think it's more about what she represented, a part of my life that was never really resolved." I nodded, feeling a mix of relief and sadness. "Then maybe it's time to resolve it for both of us. You can't keep one foot in the past and expect this to work." He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw something shift in his expression. A determination, a willingness to finally confront the shadows he'd been carrying. "You're right," he said softly. "I owe it to both of us to let go, fully and completely. But I need your help. I can't do this alone." I squeezed his hand, feeling the smallest spark of hope ignite within me. "Then let's face it together," I replied. And in that moment I knew we were finally on the path toward something real, something unburdened by the weight of the past. After our conversation, a calm seemed to settle over Alexis. It was as though a hidden burden had lifted, though I could tell there were still shadows lingering in his eyes. The next weekend, he asked if I'd go with him to a small cafe where he once used to meet her, a place he hadn't visited in years. I hesitated but nodded, understanding that this was a part of his journey toward closure, and a step toward rebuilding the trust between us. When we arrived, he grew quiet, lost in thought as he glanced around the cafe. The soft clinking of cups, the murmur of conversations, it all seemed to bring memories rushing back for him. I waited, giving him space, until he finally turned to me with a quiet resolve. "It's strange being back here," he said, his voice barely a whisper. I remember thinking this was the place where everything would start, but it was also the place where everything ended. I reached for his hand, silently reassuring him that I was here, that he didn't have to face this alone. "What happened?" I asked gently, not prying but inviting him to share if he was ready. He took a deep breath, his gaze shifting as he finally spoke. "She left suddenly, without an explanation. One day she was here making promises about a future together, and the next she was gone. I was young and naive, and I didn't realize that she was looking for something I couldn't give her. She needed freedom, maybe even an escape. And I was left here in this cafe wondering why I wasn't enough." The pain in his voice was raw, and for the first time, I saw Alexis not as my husband but as a man still haunted by a love that had left him broken. I squeezed his hand, a quiet support as he continued. "For years I buried it, convinced myself that it didn't matter. I went on with my life, my work, even this marriage. But when I saw her again," he paused, struggling for words, "I realized that part of me had never forgiven her. Or maybe I'd never forgiven myself." I felt my own heart ache as I listened, understanding that his journey to closure was as much about self-forgiveness as it was about letting go of her. "Alexis," I said softly, "you have to let this go. Not for her, but for yourself. And for us. You don't have to keep punishing yourself for something that wasn't your fault." He looked at me, his eyes filled with a vulnerability I hadn't seen before. "I know. And I want to. I want to be fully present here with you. I'm done with the ghosts of the past." For the first time I felt the wall between us crumble. In that quiet cafe surrounded by memories that once haunted him, he finally let go. I could see it in the way he looked at me, a man finally free of the past, ready to embrace the present. As we left, he reached for my hand, holding it tightly, as though anchoring himself to this moment, to me. And I knew then that this wasn't just the end of his journey to closure. It was the beginning of something new for us, a real foundation on which to build our lives together. The days after our visit to the cafe were different. The air between Alexis and me felt lighter, our conversations easier. He no longer seemed haunted, no longer lost in distant thoughts or buried memories. There was a new openness between us, a quiet but unmistakable warmth that hadn't been there before. One evening as we sat together on the balcony, watching the city lights twinkle below, Alexis turned to me with a soft smile. "I know I haven't said it much," he began, his fingers tracing mine, "but thank you for not giving up on me, for helping me find my way back." His words were simple, but I could feel the depth of gratitude in his voice. "We all have things we hold on to, things we need to face," I replied, squeezing his hand. "I'm just glad you let me be part of it." He leaned in, pressing a gentle kiss to my forehead. "I want this marriage to be more than what we planned," he murmured. "More than just an arrangement. I want us to build something real, something that isn't just about obligation or convenience." The sincerity in his eyes took my breath away. This was the moment I'd secretly hoped for but had been too afraid to wish for, the moment when we would stop being partners in name and start becoming partners in life. I smiled, my heart fluttering. "Then let's do it," I whispered, feeling a surge of hope and excitement. "Let's build something real." From that night on, we became intentional in how we spent time together. We started having quiet breakfasts, sharing stories about our days, our hopes, and our dreams. Alexis introduced me to his hobbies, things he'd never shared before. We cooked meals together, laughing over burnt toast and spilled flour, our laughter filling the silence that had once haunted our home. One evening he surprised me with a small, simple gift. A journal, its cover embossed with delicate golden leaves. For us, he said shyly, handing it to me. To record our story, the one we're writing together now. Tears pricked my eyes as I opened the journal, tracing my fingers over the empty pages. A blank canvas waiting to be filled with moments, memories, and hopes. I looked up at him, feeling my heart swell with gratitude and love for this man who, despite his struggles, had chosen to walk this path with me. Our journey wasn't perfect. We still had misunderstandings, moments of frustration, and late nights spent working through lingering doubts. But we faced them together, each obstacle a reminder that we were no longer bound by the past, but by the promise of a future we were building. One quiet evening as we sat together, I turned to him and asked, "Do you think we'll ever look back and wonder how we got here?" Alexis smiled, reaching for my hand. "No," he said softly, his gaze steady. "Because from now on, every moment will be part of our story. A story we'll look back on and be proud of." And in that moment I knew whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever memories would fade or deepen, we had found something truly real. We had become more than a practical arrangement, more than two people sharing a life. We had become a true partnership, one built not only on promises but on a shared commitment to be there for each other, no matter what. Months passed, and life settled into a beautiful, steady rhythm. Alexis and I had grown closer than I'd ever thought possible, and our relationship had transformed in ways I couldn't have foreseen. The shadows of the past no longer loomed over us. Instead, they had become part of our shared story, a story of growth, forgiveness, and healing. One autumn evening, we decided to return to the cafe where Alexis had first confronted his past. This time the air felt different. We sat together by the window, our fingers intertwined, watching the world outside as a soft drizzle began to fall. "Do you remember the first time we came here?" Alexis asked, a gentle smile tugging at his lips. "It feels like a lifetime ago." I nodded, thinking back to that tense, uncertain day. "I remember," I replied, looking into his eyes. "It was the day we started to truly understand each other." He reached across the table, his hand warm and familiar in mine. "I never told you this," he began, "but that day when I let go of the past, I also realized something else. I realized that you weren't just my partner, you had become my home." His words struck me deeply, and I felt a warmth spread through my chest. Alexis had come so far, and so had I. We had faced our own fears, our uncertainties, and had emerged stronger together. The evening wore on, and as the cafe grew quieter, I felt a sense of peace settle over us. A feeling that we were exactly where we were meant to be. We didn't need grand declarations or sweeping promises. The quiet understanding between us was enough. As we walked home through the rain, Alexis wrapped his arm around my shoulders, pulling me close. "I think," he murmured, "that this is how life should feel, simple, steady, and full of moments that remind you what really matters." We arrived back at our home, and as we stepped inside, I glanced at the journal he had given me. It lay open on the coffee table, a few pages already filled with stories and memories we had made together. I picked it up, smiling as I read through the small notes and reflections we had left for each other. Simple gestures that had built a foundation of trust and love. Then I turned to the next blank page, took a pen and wrote a single line. "This is just the beginning." Alexis glanced over my shoulder, reading the words. He took the pen from my hand, added a line beneath mine and smiled. "Then let's make it a story worth telling." In that quiet moment, surrounded by the ordinary comforts of our life together, I realized we had found something far more valuable than either of us had ever imagined. A bond that would carry us forward, through the everyday beauty and challenges of life. Our pasts had shaped us, but they no longer defined us.